Why is Russia using World War II as its major historical anchor? Why is the end of World War II seen in Ukraine as a victory of one evil over another rather than a victory of good over evil? What was Ukraine's role in World War II? You're listening to the Explaining Ukraine podcast. Explaining Ukraine is a podcast by UkraineWorld, an English-language media outlet about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm the chief editor of UkraineWorld and the president of PEN Ukraine. This is my monologue about Ukraine's role in World War II and why World War II is still playing a huge role in Russian propaganda. Before we start, let me remind you that you can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. You can also support our trips to the frontline areas, our regular trips to the frontline areas, via PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. So let's begin. Okay, so let's begin reflecting about the story of World War II. I'm making this episode on the 9th of May, and we have the parade, the so-called parade in Moscow about this. And it's obvious that for Russia, World War II is seen as a major historical anchor and major historical event that actually leads its propaganda. So one of the key messages, one of the key narratives of Russian propaganda is that Russia is still fighting against Nazism and fascism, are of course related to the World War II and to the victory over Nazism in 1945. But recently I was thinking about this and saying to myself, but look, it's not the victory in the World War II that actually leads Russia's war against Ukraine. It's a defeat. It's a defeat in the Cold War, in another war. Russia perceives its history as going from victories to losses, from victories to defeats, and it tries to praise the victory of the World War over the Nazism in the World War II to hide the fact, from itself, to kind of repress the fact that it lost actually another big war, which was a Cold War against the so-called collective West, as it exists in Russian imagination. And it's precisely the attempt to make a revenge against this defeat in the Cold War that leads Russian efforts today, that leads Russian efforts in the current moment. Let's look on the victory in the Second World War in a broader perspective. Now, you can think about the Russian history as a kind of a history of an attempt to bring its essentially Asian empire, geographically Asian. I'm not using the word Asian in any other sense than geographical. Asian empire into Europe, into the European continent. And there were several moments of success, but also several moments of retreat. So the moments of success for Russia were, for example, the reign of the Peter I and Catherine II throughout the 18th century, which secured to them the access to this intermarium space, to the space between the seas, between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, the space which one can say is the heartland of Central Europe, and the space which was very important for the history of European continent in the Middle Ages and in the early modern times up until the 18th century. So this is the space where the Kiev medieval state was located, the state that connected the Vikings north with the Byzantine Greek south. So the Vikings Black Sea with the Byzantine, essentially Byzantine, but also Genovese and all the other kinds of Black Sea south, and this was the in early modern times, in late medieval times and early modern times, this was a grain duchy of Lithuania, a kind of a successor of this Kiev medieval state of Rus, and then it was, of course, Rzeczpospolita, the Commonwealth between Poland and and Lithuania, and it was all destroyed in the 18th century when Russia got access to this axis between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, and eh, and this was the deed of Peter I at the beginning of the 18th century and Catherine II at the end of the 18th century, and it was secured by the victory of Alexander I over Napoleon in early 19th century, which actually, you know, made Russia into a not only Eastern European but also Central European power, which basically made Russia control the big amount of the Central and Eastern Europe, and in effect, in a way, this was the idea that was dominating throughout the 19th century, that Russia is about the whole Eastern Europe. So parts of the Central and Eastern Europe, of course, were controlled by the Habsburg empire, but in many accounts, basically, what was the East, what was the Eastern Europe for the Western Europeans, for other continents, it was Russian Empire. It was not only Ukraine, it was current Belarus, it was current Baltic states, it was partially current Finland, but also the big amount of Poland. And this possessions in the Eastern Europe were lost after the First World War. After Russia lost the First World War, after it retreated from the First World War in 1917, after the Bolshevik coup d'etat in 1917, and after that, Russia lost lots of things. It lost the Baltics, it lost initially Ukraine, it lost initially the Caucasus, it lost, of course, Poland, and then what we call what people in many places of the world usually call the Russian Civil War was not a civil war, actually. Was, of course, a civil war in the sense of fights between the whites and the reds, but in many other aspects it was a revenge war, a reconquest war of the new Russian Red Empire over the territories it has lost. And one of the important aspects was, for example, the battle for Ukraine. So Ukrainians who did not succeed, contrary to Poles, for example, or contrary to Finland, or contrary to the Baltics, the Ukrainians did not succeed to preserve their independence. And in a way, this reconquest of Ukraine was also reconquest of, one must say, the access to the Black Sea, and reconquest of the Caucasus, and reconquest of Ukraine. Now, what remained is the access to the Baltic Sea, and this is what happened during the Second World War and during the Winter War against Finland. So, what Soviet Union / Russia had in 1945 was a reconquest of this intermarium space, in the space in between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. Okay, and this is an important thing for us to understand. Why? Because this drama, in quotation mark, the drama of losing the access to this axis between the Baltic and the Black Sea repeated after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Baltic states became independent. Ukraine became independent. Georgia became independent. Moldova became independent. And Belarus became independent, right? So this space between the two seas became non-Russian again, as it actually was for many centuries in Middle Ages, in early modern times. So it became Russian, quote unquote, only by the end of the 18th century, only relatively recently, if we look at the deep history of this region, of this intermarium region. Okay, so we should see how the loss in the Cold War actually meant for Russians this retreat, which is very comparable to the defeat in the First World War, and therefore a willingness to take a revenge for that was very important for Russian geopolitical strategy. afterwards. So it's not only about Putin and everything. It's about the big instincts of Russian imperialism that believes that it actually should control the big part of the Eastern, Central and Eastern Europe through controlling the space between the Baltic and the Black Sea. And therefore, this is the model. The victory in the Second World War is a kind of a model for Russians how we should take revenge for this defeat in the Cold War. How we should take this revenge, and taking this revenge actually means coming back to this space between the seas, between the Baltic and the Black Sea, and that means control over Georgia. That means control over Ukraine. That means an ideological, at least ideological control over Romania and Bulgaria. That means maybe territorial control over the Baltic states, maybe some territorial control or at least ideological control over over Finland, and maybe some influence over the Central European states like Slovakia, Hungary. Well, it's going deeper into the Central Europe, and in order to have an influence on Poland as well. Okay, so this sounds crazy in the 21st century, because why would you think about these seas again? Because these seas were important for the age of the Peter the First and Catherine II, because Russia wanted to, to get to Europe and to get to the European Atlantic trade, and it was also important to get into the seas that you will lead Russia to the Atlantic trade. While now, as we all know, the very important element is the Pacific, and another very important element is the Arctic, and all this stuff. But it's still very important. Somehow, it's still very important for the imagination of the Russian Empire today, and therefore, I'm repeating this again and again. The battle for Ukraine is a battle is only one part of this, one half of these battles. Another battle can be around around the Baltic Sea, and that means attention to Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, attention to Finland, attention to Poland. Okay. Another aspects which I would like to share with you is the aspect of how Ukrainians perceive the end of the World War II, and how many other Central and Eastern Europeans perceive it, and how it is different from both the Western European slash American and the Russian perception of the end of the World War II. Because both from the collective, for the collective West, I still use it as a metaphor, and for Russia, the end of the Second World War meant the victory of good against evil. So for the collective West, the key story was, of course, the story of evil, the story of Nazism and fascism. And the end of the Second World War meant the end of this evil, with all the consequences of this thought, which I think were very dramatic, for at least for Europe, made it unprepared for the current war as well. And I reflect upon this in my podcast Thinking in Dark Times and the episode about evil, which will be published soon. For Russia, for Soviet Union, the focus was not on evil but on good, on, in quotation marks, on the Russian perception of good. So Russian perception of the good was, of course, everything that has defeated Nazism, and therefore Stalinism was also perceived as good, communism was perceived as good, the big Russian imperialism was perceived as good, and therefore, as it was perceived as good, the collapse of the Soviet Union, was perceived as evil, and therefore all the efforts are now, used to come back to this so-called good of the Soviet times. Of course, reinterpreted in a much more conservative, much more religious terms right now under Putin. Okay, but for Ukrainians, for the Baltic states, for Poles, for many other nations, well, the end of the World War II meant the victory of one evil over another one. It was not a victory of good over evil, it was a victory of one evil over another one. Why? Because, I mean, why did we decide that Stalinism was better than Nazism? It was clear for such important intellectuals in the early 20th, like in the mid 20th century, just after the Second World War, like Hannah Arendt, for example, that Nazism and Bolshevism are just two different expressions of the totalitarianism, and they were both condemnable. They were both bad. At some point, this idea just evaporated. I think it evaporated probably in 1970s, maybe 1960s. I don't know when basically the evil of Nazis was perceived as greater than the evil of Stalinism, which was a mistake, I think, because if we judge by the number of deaths, if we judge by the cruelty of repressions, if we judge by the presence of violence in the society, etc., etc., of course, the Bolshevism and especially Stalinism are comparable with the history of Nazism. The pattern of violence was different because in Nazism, the pattern of violence was directed against specific group of people, Jews, which were, had no chance to survive and which were proclaimed as having no right to life. To other groups as well, some other groups like Roma or to a lesser extent Slavs. In the Stalinism, basically you can say that no group was designed as, immune from violence. Any group was subject for violence, and not even any group, but any individual. So you can say that, well, first it was bourgeoisie and peasants suffered from mass killings during the artificial famines, etc. But then all the purges of the 1930s led to, as we know, to extermination of the very committed Bolsheviks, and this explains different patterns of violence in Nazism and Stalinism, but the difference of these patterns of violence should not hide the fact that they were both based upon a certain type of thanatocracy, a certain type of violence that is considered as the key management tool of the society, violence and death. Okay, so for Ukrainians and for many other Central and Eastern Europeans, 1945 was the victory of one evil against another one, and therefore the lessons that, for example, the Western world has taken, like let's think through it, let's analyze this evil of fascism and Nazism, let's make sure that it never repeats again, etc., etc. It was not really the key lesson. The key lesson was how to for dissidents, and then for after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the key lesson was how we fight against the actual evil, which is right now, not against that evil that we have defeated in the past, and we should prevent it because we are now living in the society of the good, but how we actually fight the current evil which is around us, which is still around us, which is still unpunished, which still hadn't seen any justice. And when Ukrainians, for example, received independence, got independence in 1991, received is a wrong word, of course, fought for their independence and got this independence, won this independence in 1991. The reflection was that, look, this evil is it's still existing. It's still existing in the form of Russian imperialism. So we should not have the logic of how to prevent it in ourselves. We should have the logic, okay, it is there, and we should somehow try to defend against it. And the realization of this need to defend ourselves was present, but also present only in minority of people, and therefore Ukraine was also not very much prepared for the Russian aggression in 2014, and therefore Russia used lots of tools, lots of efforts to conquer Ukraine through the information technologies, through the cultural field, through the media communications, through ideologies, through soft power, etc., etc. And Ukrainians were not always immune to that, yeah, right? So, but the difference of these patterns of thinking is important. It explains why Ukrainians are much more prepared to defend themselves against Russia than, for example, people in Western Europe, and unfortunately also people in Central and Eastern Europe that joined the European Union and felt themselves like, okay, we are already in perpetual peace. Like the wars are over, we are in perpetual peace. So this idea that the West, the collective West idea that we defeated the evil, evil is in the past, we should prevent it from returning, but still it's in the past, was of course very myopic, very hypocritical, because there was a lot of evil of colonialism still going on after the Second World War, and hidden colonialism even after decolonization process. But again, the conscious, the mindset of this of Eastern Europeans, some of them, I'm not saying all of them, was different. Was the idea that evil is not in the past; it is in the present and probably also in the future, inevitably in the future. And therefore, it's not only about preventing the evil which is not here; it's fighting against evil which is already here. Okay, so these are, I think, the important reflections which I would like to share with you. And the final element is the place of Ukraine in the World War II. And I would refer you to two publications that we have made. One of it is a podcast that we have recorded, I think, last year with the last year or 2 years ago. I need to check. With the prominent Ukrainian historian Serhiy Plokhy, I think 2 years ago. So I will just add this link into the description, and this is an analysis of Ukraine and Russia in the World War II. I really advise you to listen to this podcast. Serhiy Plokhy is one of the greatest Ukrainian historians, and he is a professor at Harvard University and author of so many books about Ukrainian history, including a book about Yalta agreements during the Second World War, including a book, the general book about Ukrainian history, which is called The Gates of Europe, and including many, many other things. There are several podcasts with Serhiy Plokhy on Explaining Ukraine podcast, but one of these podcasts about the Second World War, I really advise you to listen to. And another publication that I advise to you is also available on our site online, which is called The Revision of History, Russian Historical Propaganda and Ukraine. And it is a study that we have made before the full-scale invasion. We analyzed the narrative of the Russian propaganda with regard to history, and then we asked Ukrainian historians to reply to this narrative. So a lot of things that I will tell you now comes from this book, so you can read it online on our website. And in particular, let me quote some things that were expressed by one of Ukrainian historians and authors of this book, Yana Primachenko. Just a few figures. So first of all, just a general remark is that, and we talk about this with Serhiy Plokhy. So it's a general myopy and general misunderstanding that people are thinking about the Second World War as basically the fight between Russia and Germany, and Soviet Union is identified with Russia, and Russia is seen as the major victim of this war, and therefore kind of lots of German policy, especially during the Ostpolitik in 1970s, was driven by the sense of guilt towards Russia. Like, we invaded Russia, we made Russians suffer so much, etc. Well, there are two things that contradict it. First, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, that in which basically Soviet Union was also the invader, also the aggressor against Poland. We all know that, I hope. And then celebrations of the division of Poland in the Soviet Union, and the idea that we're actually coming back to the Russian Empire of the 19th century, right? So Soviet Union was not the victim of the aggression; it was the aggressor itself. Yeah, and of course the Winter War against Finland. But the second fact is that, the major battles were not in Russia, and basically it's a tiny, tiny, tiny part of Russia, current Russia, current Russian Federation, that, and at that time, Russian Soviet Socialist Federative Republic, that Nazis have actually occupied. Just look at the major battles that decided the the future of the Second World War. Look at the Battle of so-called Stalingrad or the current Volgograd and locate it on the map and see how many kilometers are from Volgograd to the Ukrainian border. And also think about the major tank battle, the famous Kursk tank battle, and also look at the map and see how far is it from the Ukrainian border. And in the news right now that Ukrainians are, trying to fight Russia still in the Kursk region, and Russians still find it very hard to kick Ukrainians out of it. So Kursk and Volgograd are so close to Ukrainian border, and it was practically the most eastern point where the Nazis have reached in the Soviet Union. So the major battles were in this intermarium, you know, in Poland, in Ukraine, in Belarus, in the Baltics. This was the major theater of the war. And therefore, the major crimes of the Nazism, including the Holocaust, took place here. And therefore, there were so many victims from the local population here. The the nation that suffered the biggest relative losses to according to its population with regard to its population is if I'm not mistaken Belarusians, but Ukrainians also are not that far away. So if we take the proportion of people killed to the general population. Okay, just a few figures from Yana Primachenko from our book about revision of history. It's called Revision of History because Russia wants to revise history, not because we want to revise history. Okay, so there were approximately 7 million Ukrainians who fought for the Red Army against Nazism, which is approximately 23% of the overall size of the armed forces in the Soviet Union. So a quarter of the Red Army. In different times there were different proportion, but we also should remember that Ukraine was occupied, and therefore, for example, conscription would be much more difficult, right? If you are not evacuated, if you stayed under the occupation, you could not have been conscripted to the Red Army. Therefore, the proportion of these people were lesser, but still it was about 20%, and it was still a huge contribution to the Red Army. What else? The total losses suffered by the Red Army is about 8.6 million persons, and out of them, 3.5 to 4 million were Ukrainians. So you can say that almost half, from the third to half of the losses in the Red Army were Ukrainians. Many Ukrainians actually got the decorations for the major decorations of the Soviet Union, meaning for example, 2,000 Ukrainians received the so-called Герой Советского Союза, Hero of the Soviet Union, which is the highest military decoration in the Soviet Union. 2,000 Ukrainians and there was several Ukrainians who received this decoration several times, like Ivan Kozhedub received it 3 times, and 32 Ukrainians received it twice. Okay, so also these famous iconic pictures of the red flag over Reichstag. This group of soldiers was actually led by Ukrainian Alexei Berest. And Ukrainians were also fighting Nazism in other armies as well. So, for example, in the Polish army, there were around 100,000 ethnic Ukrainians, and in the American army, there was 40,000 Americans of Ukrainian origin that were actually in the Normandy landing operation, and a total of 80,000 Ukrainians served in the American army, according to Yana Primachenko. There were also Ukrainians in the Canadian army, from 35,000 to 50,000. and 5,000 were fighting in the French Foreign Legion. Okay, so losses. Again, quoting Yana Primachenko from our book, human losses suffered by Ukraine during World War II total from 5 to 14 million people. Okay, so it's actually a huge number. Think about 4 million people who were starved to death in 32, 33 artificial famine. Think about hundreds of thousands who were killed in the Russian Gulag or result of repressions, and think about this figure 5 to 14 million people. Well, that's a huge number of people that Ukraine lost in this blood decades. Again, quoting Primachenko, recent estimates made by Ukrainian historians tell us that the population of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic fell from 42 million people in June 1941 to 32 million people in May 1945. That means that Ukraine lost about 10 million people. So I told you that from 5 to 15 to 13, but this estimation might mean that about 10 million people, including about 3 million people that served in the Red Army, and 2.4 million people were taken to Germany from the territory of Ukraine. Okay, so in this book we have some conflicting figures as to how many soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, died in the Red Army. Well, at one place it's from 3 to 4, at another place it's around 3. Well, let's think that it is around 3 million people, which is still out of 8.6 million people, soldiers who died in the Red Army. It's a big number. During the war, 714 cities, 28,000 villages, and 419,000 manufacturing facilities were destroyed on the territories of Ukraine. 330,000 works of art, historical artifacts, and collections were taken out of Ukraine. So if you think about these figures, and again, you can actually take them from our book Revision of History, which you will find in the section Books on our website UkraineWorld.org. If you think about these figures, like several million, well, okay, to summarize, Ukraine could have lost about 10 million people during the Second World War. Out of them, probably about 3 million people is soldiers in the Red Army, Ukrainian soldiers in the Red Army. There were people deported outside, hundreds of cities and dozens of thousands of villages destroyed, and hundreds of thousands manufacturing capacities, and hundreds of thousands of works of art taken from the Ukrainian territory. If you think about this, if we all collectively think about this, well, this is huge. This is like literally turning Ukraine into desert. And this is the heritage with which we should be coping. So this is why I'm actually saying that people who think about that probably Germany or other invading powers need to feel guilty about Russia. Well, we should think about the cost, the price that was paid by Ukraine, that was paid by Belarus, that was paid by all this region, which is is called Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder, but which was so important for the history of Europe, and very often a battlefield between East and West, and very often the heart of this battlefield was Ukraine. So these are my reflections upon the story of the Second World War and the role of Ukraine in it, and how we perceive it, and how Russia perceives it. And let's not forget that this story is one of the key motivating factor and key ideological factor for Russia to launch this another war, just to make sure that they can repeat this war. So the slogan "Never Again," which was dominating and still dominating the Western world after the Second World War, and the slogan "We can repeat," which was very important and still very important for Russia, trying to bring this war back, bring the major war back, because as they think, this is the only strength of Russians. They are strong in wars, they are weak in peace. They can do wars, they cannot do peace. And this is the problem. So, unfortunately, we need to face it, and we need to defend against this thanatocratic power, the power that values death so much and values violence so much, because probably it is so weak at other things which are so important for human nature, like talking to each other, loving each other, caring about each other. But we believe that we will win. Thank you for listening. This was a podcast explaining Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm the chief editor of UkraineWorld. I'm the president of PEN Ukraine. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher and writer. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. And you can also support our volunteer trips to the frontline areas at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You will find these links in the description of this episode. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.